His Royal Highness Prince Razi bin Muhammad of Jordan said not long ago, "Sacred art is to do with beauty, and beauty is a universal language. Beauty can break down barriers better than any interfaith dialogue. The revival of traditional Islamic art has been the best messenger and the best barrier breaker between Islam and the West, because people come and they say, this is beautiful. It's not beautiful because it's Islamic, it's just beautiful, it's universal. And so people come away from traditional Islamic art with a positive image of Islamic civilization, and even a laugh for Islamic civilization. And of course the title of this talk is The Islamic Garden, an Opportunity for Bridge Building Between Cultures. So there's no doubt that the traditional Islamic garden is one of the finest examples of Islamic art. All arts born of civilizations other than our own need some explanation for a true understanding, and the arts of Islam are no exception. However, what is important and helpful in attempting to understand other cultures through their art is to look at what is common and universal, as well as to look at their differences, and to value them both. For the British, the so-called nation of gardeners, what better way of introducing the civilization of Islam than through its great tradition of gardens? The beauty of a garden may break down barriers in an enjoyable and soothing way that's open to all. Through the actual experience of being in the garden, whether walking amongst the trees and flower beds, sitting contemplatively by a fountain, or playing with children, an idea of its underlying principles may arise, and an opening to a better understanding of the culture behind it. I'd just like to mention here the World of Islam Festival, which took place in 1976. Now, looking at most of you, I'm sure that you certainly won't remember it, but maybe you've heard of it. It had a tremendous effect in portraying a positive view of Islam to a largely ignorant and possibly prejudiced audience, although it's probably true to say less prejudiced than today. Now, the world has changed since then, as we know. More than ever do we need to portray a positive image of Islam, both to the West as well as to the Islamic world itself. And for many reasons, something like the World of Islam Festival may not be possible again. But we can do what we can through not just interfaith dialogue, as Prince Razi said, but through action, through making beautiful art and gardens. This is the garden in Seville, one of the many beautiful gardens at the Alcazar in Seville. And these gardens will have, inshallah, a lasting effect upon a community, not only through the actual art, architecture and garden itself, but more importantly through the process of making them. When a community is involved in this from the beginning, especially with the design and planting of a garden where everyone may participate, it has a tremendously bonding and integrating effect. So my talk this evening focuses not only on the Islamic garden, but also on the importance of beauty and the sacred being an integral part of this beauty. Traditional Islamic art is fundamentally founded upon the sacred, and it is from this that its transcendent and awe-inspiring quality springs. In fact, one could say that it's parallel to medieval Christian art of this country. This is Salisbury Cathedral. The great cathedrals and their monastic gardens and cloisters are based upon the same outlook as the mosques of Islam, and with their central courtyards. Indeed, the arts of all the great traditions of the world are founded upon a similar spiritual perspective, whether the subject be an icon, a Christian icon, a Hindu temple, or an Islamic pattern, or a mosque. This is Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo that we see here. They're looking inwards and upwards. This is what one can say about the cathedrals with their cloisters and the mosques in their courtyards. Beauty is conveyed via a multiplicity of languages, all fundamentally pointing to the single universal truth. This universalist view is vital in understanding the role that art and gardens may play in undermining prejudice between cultures and traditions and illuminating ignorance. Sacred art and beauty thus go hand in hand. But what is sacred art? Briefly, we could say that it's the presence of the celestial and the beyond form within the realm of form. It is the divine beauty captured by craftsmen over generations through not only technical skill passed down from master to apprentice, but also through discipline, through dedication, patience, reverence, inspiration, and above all through love. As one writer puts it, sacred art is heaven descended to earth rather than earth reaching towards heaven. And there's no doubt that the Taj Mahal is a clear manifestation of this. And since I've been fortunate enough to visit India twice twice recently, I make no apology for showing another image of it, even though, as my niece said to me when we were travelling, no other building is so ill-served by photographs. But you can get a little taste. Islamic art, like all the other arts of the world, speaks through its own forms and the symbols integral to those forms. Symbolic language is an essential element of all sacred and traditional art, since hand in hand with beauty it leads us from the outer visible world to the inner invisible world, from form to essence. Sacred and traditional art demand the sensitive and knowledgeable employment of proportion, harmony, balance, rhythm, and colour. The aim being to exalt nature and capture her inner wisdom, rather than copying her outward manifestation, which is clearly limited in its scope. This, of course, is the difference between naturalism in Western art and Islamic art, which you can see clearly here. The geometry, calligraphy, and arabesque. Three main elements of Islamic art. This art points to hidden truths through geometry and mathematics, and what we call arabesque or Islami. It results in a clear, limpid beauty of calm repose, reflecting the unity of spirit that characterises Islamic art. It is objective and impersonal and is centred on divine unity. To quote Titus Burckhardt, the great writer on Islamic civilization, in Islamic art, unity is never the result of a synthesis of component elements. It exists a priori, and all the particular forms are deduced from it. The total form of a building or interior exists before its parts, whether they have a static function or not. This is a fountain in the Court of Myrtles at the Alhambra. Some of you might recognise it. The centre of the mosque or madrasa and courtyard house is the point from which everything radiates, the heart of each often being the fountain. It is open upwards towards the sky, and is closed from the public sphere, the street, keeping the inner private and hidden, like paradise itself. So to return to the main subject of the talk this evening, the Islamic garden. What is an Islamic garden? Many people ask me. Why is it different from other gardens? The Islamic garden was born out of what might be termed a divine meeting place between four factors. The first three, horizontal, earthly factors, brought together and given new life by the fourth, vertical, transcendent one. The first is that the idea that paradise is a garden is a very ancient one, predating all three Abrahamic religions by centuries, going as far back as the Sumerian period, 4000 BC. The second is the oasis, of course, the quintessential desert garden of fresh water and date palms. And the third is the garden's geometric design based on the number 4, which derives from the ancient Persian prototype, of which I'll mention a little bit later. But of course, finally, the defining cause of the Islamic garden is the Quran itself, with its sublime descriptions of the Jannat al-Firdaus. I don't like to pronounce Arabic amongst so many expert Arabists, but the gardens of paradise, infusing all of the other factors with a whole new spiritual and intellectual world vision. Titus Burckhardt, who I mentioned just now, writes that art is essentially form. And to speak of form is also to speak of symbolism. Since, as Burckhardt continues, there is a rigorous analogy between form and spirit, and this is fundamental to all sacred and traditional art. One could say about the Islamic garden also that there's the garden contained, which we're mostly looking at here, and the garden as container. Sorry, we're looking mostly at the garden as container here, the enclosed garden. This is a mosque which I know Sidi Abdul Hakim knows well, in Granada. It's an example of a new mosque which is really a very beautiful mosque. It fits in very well with its surroundings, and then it has quite a pleasant garden. So this fourfold form of the quintessential Islamic garden, the Chahar Bagh from the Persian, which indicates its formal origin, of course, because if you're from Iran, everyone thinks the Islamic garden is a Persian garden. It's this, and this is a good example. And I will venture now to expand just a little of the many layered symbolism that is inherent within this idea of the fourfold garden, which of course the four rivers of paradise, which are generally, I've noticed, in most gardens, because it's so difficult to keep water going, they've transferred themselves into four paths instead of rivers. The Chahar Bagh is essentially a reflection of the archetypal heavenly gardens described in the Quran, mainly in Surah Al-Rahman, chapter 55. This is another garden from Seville, and you can see here that the paths with the central fountain, and there's paths crossing to make the four. Of course, this idea of the fourfold garden, there's not a blueprint of the garden's design in the Quran and layout. This was mainly inherited from this ancient Persian geometric prototype that I've just mentioned, and that arose largely from the optimum method of irrigation. So what I mean is that the many descriptions of the gardens of paradise, as well as their specific reference of the four gardens in chapter 55, they provide the underlying meaning and motivation for the Islamic garden on earth. This idea of the practical and the spiritual go hand in hand always in a traditional society, which was faintly echoed by William Morris and the Pre-Raphaelites, the idea that nothing in the home should be both functional and beautiful. So the Quran provides the inner dimension, the hakika, or the spiritual truth, which penetrates all traditional Islamic art, and indeed the whole of the Islamic civilization. And this, in brief, is what is meant by divine unity, Tawheed, the central message of the Quran. In such a civilization, there is no separation between the sacred and the profane, and daily life is a constant interaction between the human and the divine. Art created in such a society has a function. It's never simply aesthetically pleasing or a purely subjective experiment, but is essentially a kind of prayer, a visual finite form offering a window onto the mysterious, invisible, infinite. So the fourfold garden is centred on a square, the geometric form of the number 4, which is associated with all things earthly. It encompasses the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 elements, and the 4 seasons. And the cube, the 3-dimensional shape of the number 4, represents solidity, the earth. And the Kaaba, as you see here, actually means cube, and it's said that the city of Mecca was traditionally divided into 4 parts by having lines drawn from the 4 corners of the Kaaba. And the circle, of course, is the great symbol of the celestial realm. And here, with pilgrims making the tawaf, or circumambulation, we see a living symbol of the meeting place between heaven and earth. Actually, they're praying, aren't they? But you have the circle and the square. And in many Islamic gardens, you have a central fountain, which is often circular. This is another one from the Alhambra, representing one of the fountains in the heavenly gardens. So the more specific symbolism of the number 4 and its relation to the Chahar Bagh derives mainly from the descriptions in chapter 55, in which the 4 gardens are divided into 2 pairs. And there's also a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ describes his ascent to heaven and speaks of 4 rivers. One of water, one of milk, one of honey, and one of wine. And these 4 rivers are also mentioned in the Quran, echoing the book of Genesis, of course, in which it is written, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted into 4 heads." It's interesting, I've never seen another fountain like this. This is also in the Alhambra, but it's a rather nice, it's like a mandala, as you can see. So you have the square enclosing the circle, heaven and earth. And the 3 paths, and then one of them is the water channel. Each of the 4 gardens contains its own fruit-bearing tree, the olive, the date palm, the fig and the pomegranate. And each also contains its own fountain. There's a very profound symbolism attached to this, which I won't go into now. It's not relevant now, but it's worth looking at if you're interested. It's important also to remember that peace, salam, is the only word spoken in the Paradise Gardens. This peace is promised to those who believe and do deeds of righteousness. So what does this peace really mean? Is it peace from the world, or is it, as is said in Sufism, peace from our own souls? Just as the external garden needs constant attention to prevent weeds taking root and disease thriving, so does the internal garden, the contemplative soul. Jalaluddin Rumi writing that the real gardens and flowers are within. They are in man's heart, not outside. The rose itself is said to have been created from a bead of perspiration on the brow of the Prophet. So the inner garden is nurtured through prayer and through the remembrance of God. And it's only thus that we may achieve that longed-for peace. And there's no doubt that being surrounded by a lovingly tended and beautiful garden, which mirrors the garden of heaven and gives us a taste of that peace, helps us in our remembrance. The word paradise actually means enclosed by walls. It comes from the Persian paradesa. And often, so we have this idea of an area isolated from its surroundings to create and protect a place of fertility and ease within, just like all the oasis gardens. It's in the nature of paradise to be hidden and secret, since it corresponds to the interior world. Al-Jannah means concealment as well as garden. Thus, one of the characteristics of the Islamic garden is its seclusion. It's a kind of sanctuary for contemplation and is often represented in miniature paintings as being surrounded by high walls. The wall garden being a typical feature of traditional houses in many parts of the Islamic world. This is from Fez. And this is a contemporary Islamic garden, part of the Al-Azhar gardens in Cairo, where you get you can see there's a bit of seclusion created not just by the seats and the walls, but also by the hedge. And we've tried to do this a little bit in the garden at the mosque, the new mosque, inshallah, because there's people walking through a lot, but either side we have some hedges to give it a little bit of seclusion. So what I hope to have made clear from this summing up of the inner meaning of the 4 paradise gardens is that the fourfold garden, the Chahar Bagh, with its central fountain, 4 channels of water or 4 pathways, combined with shade-giving trees, scented flowers and herbs, did not arise simply from the best solution to irrigation and environmental conditions, or the most aesthetically pleasing design, although all these are very important. It is fundamentally a reflection of a profound and universal order, both inspired by and representative of a spiritual vision of the cosmos. For our purposes here, that is, the Islamic garden as an opportunity for building bridges, The point to emphasise is that this fourfold form, far from being exclusively Islamic, is universal. It may be adapted to constructing gardens in a wide variety of geographical areas, climates and environments. The form provides the order and ground plan, and the trees and planting provide what we call in the trade soft landscaping, the soft landscaping, which balances the ordered plan. And thus, for a garden designer like myself, it does provide one with principles, but you can apply these order and principles to a multiplicity of locations, because then you adapt the local planting. We don't import palm trees, for example, which look completely out of place, in my view, in this country, although some people do use them. And this idea of being secluded and having rooms has also been used by well-known English gardens. This is Sissinghurst, which some of you may have been to, a very well-known garden in England, in Kent. So you can see its ordered layout with very mixed and exuberant planting. And it's interesting to consider the similarities between the traditional Islamic garden. This is back again to part of the Alhambra complex. And the European medieval garden, centred on the monastic tradition, which I mentioned before. They both focus on the inward and upward. This is a cloister at Westminster Abbey, which Sidi Abdul will know well, having been to school there. There's a series of cloisters there, actually, very, very, very beautiful places. And of course the quadrangles here at Cambridge, Oxford and Cambridge, they exactly mimic this system, and it's very, very similar to the Islamic Islamic architecture and gardens and the interior garden. And this is Winchester College also. One could almost just take the cross away and replace it with a pool, and then you'd have a Muslim garden. These are in very stark contrast to the later post-Renaissance gardens in Europe. Not all of them, of course, and this is an exaggerated version, but you can see here in the west, this is from the 17th century in France. Very grandiose formality, actually epitomised probably by Versailles also, where the emphasis is on the outward and the horizontal. Demonstrations of man's skillful arrangement of nature and his ability to manipulate and show off and do a lot of topiary and, well, you can see bedding plants. So, in a traditional garden, of course, there's plenty of room also for interpretation and for creativity. We often get criticised at the Prince's School. People come and they say, oh, it's the same old thing over and over again because you're using a traditional language which has been handed down. And it's the same with gardens, but within that language there is an infinite variety of things that one can work with. This is a contemporary garden in Ibiza. And again, you've got the fourfold form with planting suitable to the local conditions with thyme and lavender and rosemary. I mean, what is important in the Quran, of course, is that nature, everything in nature is a symbol. The whole of nature is a book that we can read which we can read if we understood the symbols. As I'm sure everyone here knows, of course, ayah means sign or symbol. And the verses of the Quran itself are signs or symbols. But everything, a leaf in nature is a sign, is a sign of God's creation. So we have to see through the outward into the essence. Now, just to talk about the elements of an Islamic garden, water is, without doubt, is the supreme element, with shade coming a close second. So for the pre-Islamic Arabs, these two were indispensable for survival in the desert and were already revered as sacred. So by the time the Quran was revealed with its promise of the gardens of paradise to the faithful and righteous, it was perfectly natural for them to accept this. There's many references in the Quran to the fountains, flowing waters and shade-giving trees, and perfect temperate climate. The phrase most often used is gardens underneath which rivers flow. The idea of water flowing underneath probably arose from the demands of a desert existence, where the only source of water for most of the year was from the oases or underground irrigation systems such as the qanats in Persia. In the gardens themselves, the water is not usually underground, but in order to irrigate the flower beds, it often has to flow in channels, sometimes under the pathways, thereby giving the visitor the impression of actually being in a garden underneath which rivers flow. This is very typical. This is the orange tree courtyard in Cordoba, which they flood every now and again, so you have this wonderful rushing water around you twice a day. So I've now mentioned 4 of the 5 main elements of the Islamic garden, namely the geometric layout based on the number 4, water, shade, and enclosure. The 5th element, I would say, is the harmonious interweaving of architecture with the garden. Whether it be a small house, a palace, or a pavilion, as shown here, this is the garden of the Sultana in the Henralife. And of course a mausoleum, the Taj Mahal being the supreme example of this. There's always this close link between the two. And the sixth element is the importance of order, balance and correct proportion between all of the above elements. This is the vital factor in determining the resulting harmony and beauty of the garden. But to reiterate an important principle, traditional Islamic art is never an amalgamation of individual elements, but it's rather the result of a pre-existing order and harmony. That is the divine unity which penetrates all of life. This is indeed the final and crucial element, and it's ultimately this principle which gives an Islamic garden its particular serene beauty. As Titus Burckhardt writes so clearly, Islamic art is essentially the projection into the visual order of certain aspects of divine unity. So just to return to water, it is, as everyone knows, vital for all life on earth. It's used not only to cleanse ourselves of physical dirt, but also symbolically to wash away sins. In Christian baptism, the blessed water is believed to purify the soul of the devil. And in Islam, the ablutions before prayer symbolically cleanse the soul as well as the body. However, more profoundly than these, water is a reflection of the soul. Its fluidity and constantly purifying quality. The closer to the source it is, whether it's a spring or melted snow or rain, the purer it is. This is symbolic of the soul's ability to purify and renew itself through the remembrance of God. I don't think there's any other gardening tradition which plays around with water as much as the Islamic tradition. It's really wonderful to see the rills, and there's a staircase, of course, at the Henralife with the water running down, and all the different fountains. And it's always a sort of sotto voce. It's murmuring. It's not loud and shouting like many contemporary fountains. Of course, here in the United Kingdom, we're blessed with a temperate climate, so the popular idea of paradise is a desert island with a palm tree. We don't want too much water, but it's good to be reminded how important it is, and how important green shade is to those living in the heat and dust of a dry and desert climate. I was reminded about this not long ago visiting Siwa, which is a wonderful oasis in the northwest of Egypt. you just get this contrast when you're driving for miles and miles and miles with that colour at the back, and then you suddenly see the oasis, the green of the palm trees, and it really gives that rest for the eye, as the saying goes. In hot and dry environment, in these environments, of course, water is not just wonderful physically, as I've just mentioned, but it's seen as a direct symbol of God's mercy, and it's described throughout the Quran as a mercy and as life-giving. The other thing is it's normally in straight lines. It's because of course it's easier to channel it like that, and it doesn't waste so much. So you get this sense of order created by the channels of water. And you get this constant interplay as well between running water and stillness, and reflect, so that the ability to reflect. I'm just showing you a few from other places. I've shown a lot from the Alhambra because it's so beautifully looked after. But this is a courtyard in Damascus. And this again, this is one of the most beautiful fountains I know. This is in the Cuarto Dorado, which is one of the entrance courtyards to the Alhambra. In fact, I think these gardens at the Alhambra and the Generalife, which although has not been under Islamic rule since 1492, it really is probably the most beautiful and most beautifully looked after of Islamic gardens in the world. And here, the Nasrid dynasty, they created these series of exquisite courtyards and gardens between 1237 and 1492, in the centre of which water is always present in some form or other. Of course, enormous changes have taken place since the 15th century, particularly in the planting. However, in spite of this, the palace courtyards and certain parts of the gardens retain a very special, quintessentially Islamic ambience. I'm sure many of you have experienced it and been there. And what you do get when you go through these courtyards also is this sort of contraction, because when you walk through this one, there's a little dark sort of bent exit and then entrance. So there's a kind of contraction physically, and there's a contraction mentally as well. And then you go out into another light courtyard. This is the Court of Myrtles, and there's this marvellous balance between the architecture, the water, and the hedges. Although, of course, before there are some pictures from the 19th and maybe sketches from the 18th century where there's much more greenery, so you get more of a balance. Especially this is true in the Court of Lions, which is the next courtyard you go to. I took this quite a long time ago when they still had green, as you can see, the citrus trees in each of the four corners, but they've even taken those out now because of the damage that the water does. But originally, there was planting in all of these four corners, so you get a better balance. Now it looks a bit stark without the green. So there are many charming intimate courtyards from the Alhambra to the Generalife with this shade-giving trees and water. And then views through oriel windows. This is a view looking across to the Summer Palace, and we'll go into the garden there next. We're kind of doing a quick walk through. And this is the Parky Palace again. I showed it to you once before, and you can see the clear reflection, and again you get this lovely balance. When you go from here, from the Alhambra Gardens, you walk across the Generalife, and there's even more of this contemplative beauty. The name Henralife probably derives from Jannat al-Arif. I'm sure some of you here have some, shall I go back? Some, you know much more about it than I do, but some say it means garden of the architect. But garden of the Gnostic is maybe closer to the Arabic. And the jewel at the heart of these gardens is the famous Patio della Acequia, which is inside there. And having walked through the others, you get to this courtyard, which is called the dismounting yard. Presumably, their horses came here. One of my favourite fountains also, and you see the four channels for water. It's very simple, but completely perfect, and it's beautiful to sit here when you let the visitors go through, and you can usually sit in that bench and there's time for a little bit of peace. And then you do this thing, this bent, it's not a bent entrance, but you get this contraction, you go in up these stairs, these dark stairs, and then out into the Patio della Acequia. This is taken quite a long time ago. They've changed the planting a lot, and the cypress tree has come down, sadly actually, because it looks nice there. But again, if you sit here for some time, this is taken more recently, you can see the planting has changed. But it's a beautiful balance again between water, architecture and green planting. But sitting here for some time again, letting the visitors pass on by, and there are approximately 6,000 per day go through the Henralife and the Alhambra. It's the most visited site in Europe apparently. But even so, if you stay there, you let the water quieten the soul, and an overwhelming sense of peace descends, and one begins to truly experience what the sense of unity really means. Another thing, which is great testimony to those who first laid the gardens out, this sanctuary-like atmosphere is still maintained, amazingly. What also strikes one when walking through the palaces and gardens is that they're all on a human scale. Nothing from this period stands out as being too large or overstated. And one could say that the form and symbolism of the Islamic garden as manifested here enables those with an open heart and mind to retrace the path back to the heavenly garden. Like all sacred art, the Islamic garden is a reminder that beauty is a path to inner serenity, a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, and an expression of faith and love. So finally, it remains for me to say that for garden designers like myself, the art of the traditional Islamic garden, as we've seen a few examples here only, but it's a great source of inspiration in creating gardens today. The fourfold form can be adapted, as I mentioned. Particularly, we've adapted it here in Cambridge. And it's especially suited to modern urban living, where many people have only a small space, because you're behind the high walls. But instead of the desert, of course, it's the city outside that we need to keep out. This is a small garden in Hampstead, very small garden in Holland Park. And this is in Paris. I mean, I heard recently that 80% of the world's population is living in cities today. So more than ever is there a desire to escape this. You see this in all the adverts for holidays. Get away from it all. And mostly, people want to get away to somewhere that is untouched by man. Virgin nature, which in itself can be said to be the greatest sacred art. However, we're not all fortunate enough to have easy access to this. So by way of recompense, we may create something beautiful in our own homes, even if this means only one modest plant. This one plant can lift the spirits, its beauty and purity reminding us of the spiritual truth at the heart of our existence. So I think my watch has stopped. I've just got about maybe 5-10 more minutes. Is that all right? So in addition to our own homes and small back gardens, the need for more communal parks or public gardens, which this country excels in, has never been greater. And of course the new mosque, when it's built, inshallah, this will offer a small garden for respite, not just for people going into the mosque, but just for passers-by. And an area, one of these parks, dedicated to an Islamic garden, just as there is Japanese Zen gardens in, for example, Holland Park and Kew Gardens. An area dedicated to a small Islamic garden could provide not only green respite, as any park does, but also, because of its underlying meaning, it offers a subtle and beautiful educational opportunity. Not forgetting here that in building bridges between cultures via gardens, we are also inadvertently strengthening the essential bridge between humankind and nature. And the Prince of Wales highlighted this in his lecture 2 years ago in Oxford on Islam and the environment, which I was just reading on the train coming up, because we're growing increasingly alien to the natural world. New books proliferate all the time on how we can get back to the wild and reconnect with nature, and in so doing connect with our true selves. And another aspect of building bridges is not to forget that the greatest bridge of all is the human being as pontifex, the bridge between heaven and earth. So, centred as it is on a universal cosmology, the Islamic garden may be applied in a wide variety of contexts, and in so doing may act as a powerful powerful vehicle for bridge building between faiths and cultures, particularly between Islam and the West. This is the Prince of Wales's garden at Chelsea, the Chelsea Flower Show, 10 years ago now. He called it the carpet garden because he looked at one of his carpets one day and thought, that will make a nice garden. 2 carpets actually. We sort of put them together and tried to make one. And then it was transferred to Highgrove, which is his house in Gloucestershire, which this was taken a long time ago. And the good thing about it is that he built the walls, there are walls around it, so it's a large secluded garden, which works quite well. It's very much a summer garden. It's closed in the winter and they have to wrap up the fountain, but it's quite nice. And it's open to the public. I mean, you have to make a special appointment, but I mean, it is possible to go and visit Highgrove Garden. So the garden, it's a potent symbol for drawing people together, not only because of its association with paradise, but also because of its prime materials, as it were, which are plants, trees and flowers, which by their nature speak of tranquility and peace. And of course water, as we have seen, the main element in the Islamic garden, has this universal symbolism of purity and heavenly mercy. So when asking the question, is it possible or desirable to make a traditional Islamic garden in different cultures and climates to those in which it was born, I feel the answer is definitely yes, but with clear qualifications. We have to provide careful attention to local planting conditions, the local environment, and then the form of the Islamic garden with its integral spiritual symbolism may be employed across the world. In our increasingly tense world, where mass migration is the norm, the art of the Islamic garden may serve as an ambassador for beauty and truth, for the beauty and truth of the religion of Islam. This was a garden at Islamic Expo, which was about 3 or 4 years ago in London, and people ended up in the garden actually. I mean, it was the only nice place sort of to sit, and you can see we had storytelling going on, which is the sort of thing you could do in a garden outside in England some of the time, not often but sometimes. So to end with this beautiful garden in Yazd in Iran, there's no doubt that a garden will make a far greater and more positive contribution to building bridges than any amount of interfaith dialogue. Thank you.